Okay, so thank you for joining this presentation. My name is Marius Stanciu. I'm a doctor in psychology, clinical psychologist, and also psychotherapist. And today I'm going to talk to you about a very important factor of personality, which is called conscientiousness. And what we know from about 30 or 40 years of research about how personality factors correlate with life outcomes, be it in terms of relationships or in terms of social professional achievements, and how mental health should go in the 21st century. So I'm going to start my presentation, and let's hope you will all enjoy it. So first of all, I will discuss about individual differences and variation. But before I'm going to do that, I'm going to give you a general outcome of what our discussion will be. In the first part of our presentation, I will discuss about the variation, the fact that all people are different. And when I say that all people are different, I'm not referring only to physical characteristics that you can see, like height or the color of your eyes, but I'm also discussing about the variation in behavioral phenotype. Now, this may sound like a very complicated concept, but the phenotype is basically what biologists call the totality of observable characteristics of a organism. So you shouldn't be, like, let's say, scared about the jargon, as it's called, like scientific talk, because I'm going to explain every concept and explain how these abstract concepts relate to everyday life and what should or what we could do about them. Okay, in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to give an outline of the five-factor model, which is the most, let's say, researched model of personality that we have today. It was derived by the lexical hypothesis, which was put forth by Galton at the end of the 19th century and had received in the last 30 years a lot of empirical data that sustain it. It was derived from the bottom to the up, not from the top to the bottom. It was not theory driven, and it was actually derived through the lexical hypothesis and factor analysis, as I told you. And in the last part of the presentation, I'm going to give some outlines of how these personality factors relate to specific life outcomes and what we can do if we want to change some of our personality factors. Okay, so the first part, that which you might not actually be interested in, but if you actually master the jargon, the scientific talk, you may have better insight of what those concepts represent. So as you can see in the presentation, like all animals, humans have variation in their phenotype. Some people have, I don't know, 2 meters tall. Some other peoples are 1.5. Like in the same way, people differ in their personality traits. That's what biologists actually call phenotype. The phenotype is simply put the genotype, the DNA, plus the environmental influences. In terms of personality, that would mean important life events, learning, and also stochastic or random processes that might affect how the DNA is translated in the phenotype. So when biologists talk about phenotypes, which means the totality, as I'm going to repeat myself, but maybe this is actually important, of characteristics that an organism has, they discuss about character and traits. For example, character is an observable aspect of a species. For example, the height of an organism is a character. The eye color, the base heart rate is a character. And we believe that some personality factors are actually characters. Traits, for example, are specific states of a character. Having 175 centimeters, for example, is a specific trait. Having brown eyes is a specific trait. Having your neuroticism, which is a general factor of personality, which I will discuss later, is again a trait of a character. Psychologists are not actually interested in easily measurable characters, like, for example, height or your index and body index, for example, but they are interested in something different, like behavioral phenotype. And the behavioral phenotype refers to how the person behaves the same in different circumstances. As I put in the slides, behavior is not something that is ossified, it's not something that fossilizes, it's not something that you can study like you study in fossils, how your ancestors, how big were your ancestors were, how long were their humerus or other bones of their body. So psychologists usually study personality, which is a vague concept, is not something specific, and behavior is not something static and easily measurable. And as Lewin put it in 1936, behavior is also dependent on the context. You may have persons which are extremely extroverted, that means sociable, they have many friends, they like to joke about things, they like to manifest themselves, which are extremely extroverted in some circumstances, but they might be introverted in some other circumstances. Imagine, for example, a person which is an influencer, like for example a person which gains a lot of money by selling her, I don't know, her or his sexual capital. He might be extremely sociable when he talks about fitness rules and nutrition and clothes, but put that person in another context, like for example a context in which what is discussed is quantum mechanics, and that person might not be that extroverted. So this is something that we know for at least 100 years, and it basically sums up to the fact that personality is manifested through the lens of a context, and behavior is not something static, it's something that's variable, and the context or the situation is extremely important in how personality traits do manifest in practice. So, as I gave you on the slides, height is an easily measurable character of a species, but a personality trait is not that easily measurable. So, we know that interest in personality and personality traits was something that humans had from antiquity. We have the works of Aristotle, of Theophrastus, we have the works much more recently of Friedrich Nietzsche or of Freud and of Carl Rogers. But the scientific study of personality, we actually believe, began in the 20th century with Gordon Allport's seminal work. And Allport introduced this concept of personality traits. So, as I discussed previously, we discussed about traits like a person having brown eyes, or a person having light skin, or a person having the humerus or another bone in your body of a specific length. That's a trait, a specific state of a character. But we also discuss about traits when we discuss about how neurotic or extroverted or open to experience or conscientious a person is. And Gordon Allport introduced this concept of personality traits. He actually believed that personality traits are not just simple abstractions, but neuropsychic entities. What he meant by that is that there are some specific mechanisms in the brain and in your body that might express those personality traits. But an easier way to look at it is, okay, a part of those personality traits are a biologically given thing. It relates to the density of some receptors in your brain. It relates to how big some regions of your brain are. We don't actually know right now. But the concept of personality trait was introduced by Gordon Allport, and he also went further with the lexical hypothesis of Francis Galton, and it's a consensus right now that personality studies, scientifically, personality studies started in the 1930s. Okay, so we don't actually measure personality traits directly. An analogy or a metaphor that I gave in the slides is that it's like looking at the sun. You don't actually see the sun directly. You see the sun through the stratosphere. You may see the sun through some glasses. You may see the sun also through another lens that you have, which is a natural lens, which is the cornea. And what the brain is fed, it's this light of the sun that is filtered through different filters. In the same manner, you could conceive personality traits as in something like black holes. You cannot measure them directly, you cannot see them directly, you measure them through behavior. I gave you some examples on the slide of how this measurement goes. For example, a person high in conscientiousness. This is a big factor of personality that has to do with orderliness and industriousness. You don't measure it directly. It's like looking at the sun. You can't look at the sun directly. You can't look at a black hole directly. You measure it through some effects it has on the environment or some probabilistic tendency that trait has on the environment. Much in the same way, we don't measure extroversion or neuroticism or agreeableness or other factors of personality directly. We measure them through how that person behaves in the same similar manner in different situations in which that person is put. And let me give you an example. Let's take this concept, which is very important, extroversion, right? It would be defined as a person who is, as I said previously, very sociable, very active, very energetic, has a high motivation to see other people, to talk, to assert itself, to become a leader of a group. But as I gave you an example before, it might not always manifest itself. And also, you cannot measure it directly because it's not a specific part of the brain, like a specific part of the body. So you measure it through different scales, like questionnaires, and you measure it through what it generates around it. Like the black hole generates a gravitational field around it. So you actually measure extroversion by looking at some indexes. For example, how many persons is this person friend to on Facebook? How many likes that he receives on a social network? How frequently does he talk about things that he doesn't know about? How many times that he jokes about things? And in the same way, we do not measure personality traits directly. We measure them through questionnaires, from instruments, and this is the realm of psychometrics, which is the measurement of not necessarily lookable upon traits of a person. For example, intelligence, the same. You do not measure it directly. You cannot assess how intelligent the person is. You give him tests. You give him things to provoke his mind, and afterwards you see how those things correlate with themselves. So, as I said, a trait is not known through its causes, as all put it, but through the causes, through what they generate in their environment. Okay, so how we define these personality traits: a disposition to act in a certain way in different life contexts. And as I said previously, let's take one of the biggest personality factors we have, like neuroticism. Neuroticism has been traditionally linked to mood disorders, to anxiety disorders, even to personality disorders. It's one of those things that clinical psychologists are interested about. How do you measure it? You measure it through a questionnaire, you measure it by an interview, you measure it through different lenses. As I put, you cannot directly look at the sun as in the same way you cannot directly look at the personality trait. You measure it through some lenses, and these lenses are questionnaires, interviews, and some other things you give to the client. So let's look at neuroticism, as I said, right? A disposition to act. Okay, we might observe some person being extremely anxious about the coronavirus, right? That's a measure indirectly of neuroticism, because somebody who has very low neuroticism might be carefree. But that's not actually something we can generalize. When you look further and put further questions and you give the person a questionnaire, you might find out that the same person doesn't care only excessively about the coronavirus, but is also scared of sharks, of let's say tornadoes, of earthquakes, and it might be even scared about a specific test. The manner in which that person relates to a specific stressor is what we consider dispositions to act. And as I put in the slides, a disposition is not necessarily something which is ontologically primary. It might be ontologically derivative of real categorical properties. For example, we might say about a sugar cube that it has a disposition to dissolve in a glass of water. That's a disposition. It might never happen. A disposition is a potentiality of something to behave in a certain way in a certain environment. In the same way, a person with high neuroticism, as I defined it earlier, might not actually develop a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder or a personality disorder if the things are right. And in the same way, when we look at dispositions to act, we might think of it as a probability of a person to react in a certain way in a certain environment. For example, a person high in neuroticism might have panic attacks, which is something measurable, even biologically measurable in terms of how high the blood adrenaline level is, cortisol level is, norepinephrine level is, and other stress hormones which your body might secrete in some situations like this. And you say, okay, this person secretes a lot of adrenaline and cortisol in different situations. Today it might be something like a test. Tomorrow it might be the fact that his significant other, his romantic interest, might give some stimulus that he might interpret in the way that this person might go away, he might leave. It might be in circumstances like I have a fight with my family. So in different situations, the person would react in the same manner, mainly in the extreme sense, having a panic attack, for example, or worrying excessively, or considering himself not to be enough to manage the situation. And this is what we talk about when we talk about personality traits, a disposition to act, a statistical probability way of thinking about situations, of feeling about situations, and on acting. And when I say acting, I also mean the neurophysiological part of the body, that part which relates to how many stress hormones your body secretes in such situations to happen. So are there actually those traits reducible, as I put in the slides, to some biological structures in the brain? Well, yes and no, because as I said previously, personality traits are not actually parts of your brain. There might be, and we know from genetic studies that personality factors vary between zero point 0.4 and zero point 0.7 in what's called the heritability index, how much you get them from genes and how much you get them from the environment and from specific experiences. But a disposition to act means a probability to act in a way given a certain input. And let's take another factor, like for example, extroversion. The tendency to talk a lot. It might manifest in a party, it might manifest in a campus, it might manifest in the class, it might manifest in the family. It's a tendency to be talkative, we say. That doesn't mean, as I previously said, that it will always manifest itself. There might be specific circumstances in which you, as an extrovert or as an introvert, might say, I'm not going to talk about this subject. But it's also a probabilistic tendency. So to give some more weight to what I'm talking about, let's look through analogy. We say about a glass that is fragile. That means that if we drop it, it will break. But that doesn't mean that a specific glass it will break. Take, for example, my jug, right? If I drop it, it might break. But this specific jug might never break. In the same way, we talk about people, about their personality traits and the higher order, a higher hierarchical order about their personality factors, that they high in neuroticism or high in extroversion. That doesn't actually mean a person that's high in neuroticism that it will develop a personality disorder or another mood or anxiety disorder or other type of disorders, like for example substance use disorder. But it means that it has a predisposition to do it. And this is what we call the diathesis stress hypothesis. Namely, that there are some vulnerabilities that are there in terms of biology, in terms of socioeconomical and family context. And when stressors go through this, the glass might break. The personality of that person might lead to a disorder, which means a temporary, usually, but sometimes it's chronically, modification in how that person reacts, and feels about the environment. So lucky individuals, even though they have those personality traits or personality factors, might have the luck of never encountering specific stimuli in the environment which leads them to the disorder. Okay, so now we get to Francis Galton, as I put on the slides, and he was the first big psychologist which introduced this idea that maybe in the same manner in which we can measure differences between people in terms of intelligence or memory, we can measure also tendencies to act, to feel, and to think about situations. And this is what I previously told you, their personality traits. So the lexical hypothesis was this idea introduced by Galton that maybe we can study personality by looking at language, because personality is something so important about explaining why a person acts in a certain way in a certain environment or in different environments, and because it offers us the idea of predictability. I can know what that person might do in a similar environment. Galton put forward this lexical hypothesis according to which we should study dictionaries and see what adjectives people found in the last 10,000 years since we have the human civilization, basically. And by looking at them, let's see what differences we can find. So Allport and Allport went further with the lexical hypothesis and collected these adjectives. And here you can see a timeline from Galton to what we have now, the five-factor structure, in which scientists progressively looked at the English questionnaire, because was basically an English endeavor, and they found through a process named factor analysis that all those adjectives tend to coalesce to cluster around five big factors. So these five big factors are neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. Okay? Now, they were derived from studies carried out mainly in English-speaking countries, but a major breakthrough came when scientists, psychologists, and psychometricists, especially, went with these questionnaires further and wanted to see, is this factor analysis procedure leading to the same five factors everywhere in the world? Are there some universals? And studies have shown that yes, these five factors might be something that are extremely linked to our genes and how culture operates universally around the world. Simple way to look to see them is through the acronym OCEAN. Right? You have openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. These are the five factors, and English-speaking people learn them through this acronym because it's like the ocean of traits, right? So you have openness to experience, a factor which is correlated to intelligence and creativity. This is the tendency of a person to be intellectually curious, to be against authorities, to be more liberal than conservative, to want to know different things, to want to taste different things. For example, openness to experience is the factor which is generally linked to the idea of trying psychedelics, of trying drugs, of trying new experiences. It is also linked to sexual experiences. For example, how would it feel if I'm going to be a week, let's say I'm going to practice something that sexually I didn't practice before. We know from a lot of studies performed in the last 14 years that openness to experience is the factor that predicts how curious a person is. And it also links to fantasy, how creative a person is, and also links to aesthetics, how interested in art a person is. So it's basically the only personality factor we found that correlates with aptitudes, such as general intelligence and creativity, unlike the other factors. Then you have conscientiousness, the main factor I was going to talk about, which might be extremely important in the 21st century. And this is about how orderly you are. Is your room tight, or is it chaotic? How much do you strive for reaching your objectives? How much work do you put into reaching those objectives? And this is another personality factor which is extremely important, because statistically speaking, it correlates with high achievement in academia, high achievement whatever work you do, with high life satisfaction, because conscientious people rarely go outside, rarely cheat their partners. And it also relates to the idea of mental and biological health, because conscientious people usually stick to a routine. They're interested in their health. They're interested in what their behaviors do to other people, and they're also interested in this idea of respecting rules. So people high in conscientious, they're very orderly and also work hard on reaching their goals. Then we have extroversion, which was theorized by Jung before the five-factor models were derived, as I told you, bottom up through factor analysis. And extroversion, as I told you, it's about how many people we would like to know, how energetic we are, how active we are, how much do we talk, where our focus goes in a social circumstance. Does it go inside of me, watching my biological and my psychological process, being introspective, or my focus goes outside, watching other people? So people high in extroversion usually are people who assume the role of leaders. They have a lot of friends. They talk a lot. They enjoy very energetic and loud music, because, as Eysenck hypothesized in the 1950s, it might have something to do with how excitable our neurons are. Eysenck, which was a very important psychiatrist, suggested that maybe the introversion extroversion distinction, which is something very old in psychology, has to do with how excitable our neurons are. For example, a person which is very high in extroversion might need a high level of stimulus to feel okay. So I need loud music, I need a lot of people, I need to be constantly stimulated and do things. Otherwise, I'm not going, phenomenologically speaking, to be okay. While introverted person might have this particularity at the neural level, even, that very high, loud music, many people, many stimuli coming and being processed by my head would go overboard, and their tendency is basically to have few friends, not to manifest themselves too much, not to talk about themselves too much, and so on and so forth. Then we have agreeableness, which is a personality factor not many talk about, but which is very important, especially at the workplace and in the family, which has to do how polite I am, how empathetic I am, how much do I emotionally resonate with another person, how good I am, how altruistic I am. And at high levels, you have people which might sacrifice themselves for the good of the family or the good of or their friends. And at the low levels, we have something that correlates with the social or antisocial personality disorder, people that you usually see committing murders because they do not empathize with others, they do not care about how others think about them, and they do not care about how society thinks about them. Let's discuss the last factor, which is the most important for a clinical point of view, neuroticism, which was theorized even by Freud. Okay, so neuroticism relates to the tendency to feel depressed when someone says something that hurts you, to be timid, to be socially awkward, to be anxious about things. And I gave you some examples previously about a person who was not always only afraid of maybe I have a medical illness, but always about things like I'm going to I'm going to bathe myself in the ocean. Maybe a shark will come and will kill me. I'm going to talk with a friend that I haven't talked with in a lot of years. Maybe he will reject me and I'm going to make a fool of myself. I'm going to have a presentation. Maybe something will happen which will make me want to kill myself. Usually, when we look at high levels of neuroticism, we see this pattern of thinking of putting the worst in front and of, let's say, amplifying how bad things are. And this is the most important clinical factor, actually, because studies have correlated it not only with mood disorders like depression. Something bad happens, I lose something, I put a lot of hope in some project, and what happens is actually lower, but also with personality disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So it's a very important clinical factor that people should know about and should actually assess, because in this diathesis stress model, we know that these are vulnerabilities. Imagine neuroticism as how strong a bridge is. Any bridge can break if the earthquake is big enough, or if enough, uh, let's say, trucks go through that bridge. But some people are more resilient and some people are not, and we don't actually understand today how epigenetics works and how some people actually develop a higher level of psychological resilience when confronted with negative factors in their lives, and so how come other people they actually break. But it's a very clinical important factor. So let's go further. And the hierarchical structure of personality says something like this. Okay, we might observe some specific behavior, as I said. Tells jokes during this presentation, tells jokes in a specific environment. Okay, this is specific behavior, which has to do also with situation, not only with the habits. Another hierarchical structure, we have the habits. Okay, a habit to make something, a habit to make the worst out of everything, a habit to worry, for example, if we're talking neuroticism. And then at a higher level, we have facets, and facets are like subpersonalities or factor. At the higher level, we have these five factors which we discovered in the last 13 years about human personality, which seem to be universal about the human being. Okay, so there are many persons who say that okay, but can social cultural situations create new factors? How many facets are there? How much is biology and how much is what we learn and the events that we go through our lives? There are no clear answers to this. The most popular instrument for measuring the five factors are NeoPR and NeoPi3, which was developed by Costa and McRae in 1992 and was refined. But think of it like this: you have people of the same height, but not all their bones are the same length. In the same manner, you can have people which have the same general score of extroversion or of neuroticism, but not all their facets are the same. So think about this, which is a graph that I'm going to put forward, which is a climb. So if you look at extroversion and you have different facets there, you can see that it's high on gregarious spirit, which means the tendency to look for other people, to enjoy herself being surrounded by other people. Activism is also high, so this means that's a tendency for feeling good only when going, I don't know, in trips, or when going outside, or when making physical exercise. But other factors are very low. For example, warmth, which is defined as the facet of extroversion that I genuinely want people to be there with me. I genuinely like people. Also low, as you can see on the graph, is the factor of assertivity, which means I talk with other people. I'm being open about what actually I don't like and how I think we can make things good. So people, even if they have the same general level of a factor, that doesn't mean that the more profound analysis, the facets of personality are the same. And one way to look at these facets is are like subpersonalities. sub-tendencies of a person to feel, to act, and to think about different situations and coping mechanisms. Okay, so as I discussed, the general 5 factors, and I gave you some descriptions of what they describe. So statistical probabilistical tendency to act in a way. So we should go further. Okay, just a second. Okay. And here I present you another way of looking at this. So people are not actually, it's not correct from a scientific point of view, and also from a humanistic point of view, to see things in dichotomies. It is either white or black. There are rather a lot of gray colors between them. So another way of looking at this is by referring to the Gaussian curve, because we know that the traits in personality are shaped like a bell. Very few people are high in a trait, very few people are very low in a trait, and the most are in the middle, as I put you on the slide. So this is another way of looking at things. So as I was going to discuss mainly conscientiousness, because it's a factor that might become more important in the 21st century. You have this variation in which people low on it might be described as careless, as people who are not very orderly, who do not work hard for achieving their goals, who do not care about duty. And at the other end, you have people which might approximate what's called obsessive compulsive personality disorder, people who can't conceive of their lives without being efficient. For example, a person very high in conscientiousness might consider, okay, I'm not doing anything, so that's bad, so I have to do something, otherwise I'm not worthy. Or it might consider something, don't have a job, so that's something bad, I don't have an objective, I should always work. Or how could I permit myself to be this untidy? Look at my room, it's not orderly. So at one end, you have people who might have problems because they cannot control their impulses, and they have problems in setting goals and being orderly. And at the other end, you might have people which are also rare, which might have the factor at extreme levels, which might make them think that they don't have value unless they always work, and they behave like robots, for example. So this is another way of looking at how our personality factors affect life outcomes, and of conceiving them not in dichotomies such as I previously said, white and black, but a lot of shades of gray, in which any person can be put on these personality dimensions, and we can derive a personality graph, as I previously showed you. Okay, so as I said, the 40 years of research has shown that they have important effects, those personality factors, and also that they're highly irritable. That means that genes contribute. Of course, genes do not contribute to the same factor in the same way. For example, the most heritable or the most influenced by genes personality factor we have is openness to experience, because openness to experience is not something that psychologists can shape, or they can't shape in a manner that has been proven to be, let's say, durable. On the other hand, neuroticism, extraversion are the factors of personality that we can actually shape and do shape during psychotherapy or counseling sessions. So I said that neuroticism doesn't correlate only with mood, anxiety, and personality disorders, but also with relationship quality. And let's look at what the factor describes: a tendency to be on the edge, always, to think the worst will happen, to always think about bad things, to let's say be moved by bad things. So it's also linked to drug abuse, gambling disorder, pathological internet gaming disorder, even other behavioral addictions. In contrast, we know from studies that people high in extroversion tend to fare better. And maybe one of the factors here is related to positive emotion, which is that facet of extroversion that people high in extroversion, or people who usually tend to have many friends, very rich support network, and they are very, let's say, active, tend to do better in life. They tend to earn more. They tend to manage their problems easier. Um, Maybe one of the motives relates to this factor of of positive emotion. They, let's say, when something good happens, they can capitalize on it. Okay, so let's go further and realize that we can't completely override our genes. Some of the variation of these factors is strictly there in our genetic code. And as I told you, studies performed of twin studies, which compare how personality develops when we have two twins that are reared in different families, showed us that the highest irritability index is for openness, and the lowest is for agreeableness and neuroticism. And this is a good thing, because the more a trait is um, not necessarily generated or determined, influenced by our genes, the less we can do. For example, height. You can't make your height much higher. You can do sports, you can do some exercises, but 90% of how high you're going to be at an adult age is determined by your genes. On the other hand, when you look at something like neuroticism or agreeableness, which are general personality factors, you know from statistics that the main input comes from life events and comes from bad luck, of encountering bad events that might shift the way you look at things, and that might contribute to the general pattern in which you process these informations. So what we know from the studies is that we don't actually control our genes or the environment, but if we know that some personality factors correlate substantially with some life outcomes, we might do something proactively. And what we might do and what we can do proactively is think logically about what happens to us, even if we have, let's say, bad luck. You go to an exam and you take a bad mark, okay? A person high in neuroticism might look at the situation: I'm bad, I'm completely an imbecile, I will never do well in life. And this is what we call in psychotherapy catastrophizing. It's a term that was introduced by Albert Ellis, who founded the rational emotive psychotherapy paradigm. And it means, okay, it's an overgeneralization. Maybe once in one specific circumstance you did bad, but you don't actually know that. You don't, working as a statistician, you don't know what variables went there. So a person high in extroversion and low neuroticism might take it, okay, I have some coping mechanisms, I will do well. Or a person high in neuroticism and low in extroversion might look at it, okay, I'm an idiot. I should always perform well. I should always do this. And this data right here shows me that I'm bad. So because neuroticism and agreeableness, and to a later extent extroversion, are not that genetically determined, it means that psychotherapy and counseling and also our voluntary work with these factors might make us go against our genes and the early experiences that might shape these factors. Furthermore, there is not an argument that all these factors are necessarily good or bad. And I gave you here some table about what benefits a high score on some factor might give you, and what cost that might give you. For example, neuroticism. I said about bad things about neuroticism because a lot of studies have shown how it correlates with mood disorders, personality disorders, resources spent on false alarms. For example, I had a client once which spent about 50,000 euros on making tests in order to prove himself that he's not sick. The test shown that he's not sick, but he also lost those resources. But there's also something good about this. For example, people high on neuroticism may be highly vigilant, and not all people are good. So this is what Nettle and Miller and Garvin discussed in their studies, that maybe there's no optimal of personality because there might be situations in our life in which a high score in something that's generally bad might give you a competitive edge. For example, people high in neuroticism are very skeptical of their partners. Some of their partners do actually cheat. So being highly neurotic, being on the edge, being hypervigilant might allow you to not lose 10 years of your life married with a person that cheats on you. And this is why there's no personality optimum. But this is where a professional in mental health would say, okay, but that's circumstantial. And that's something that you can use your logic in order to see where it's good to be high in neuroticism and where there are circumstances where you're going to spend a lot of resources by false alarms. In the same way, let's take conscientiousness, right? Because this is the main subject of our discussion. Conscientiousness usually correlates with good work, with being rich, with high stability in your personal and romantic relationships, but it also can lead to rigidity. It can also lead to obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Is it a good trait? Well, it's circumstantially good. It might be bad. A person very high on conscientiousness, especially the orderliness factor, might be put in situations where his or her obsession about making everything tidy or clean might generate interpersonal conflict. So these personality traits are not necessarily good or bad, unlike intelligence, which is generally good because it describes your capacity to solve problems. They're circumstantially good or bad, and this is a very simple genetical and evolutionary explanation of why our personalities are not and can never be optimal, and also why we have such interpersonal differences, such individual differences, as I saw psychologists call it. So being highly neurotic or highly conscientious is not necessarily always bad. In the case of neuroticism, always good for yourself, for your mental health, for your life outcomes. It's circumstantial. So basically, what modern personality psychology tells you is, okay, but there is this general, let's say, capacity in you to think from situation to situation and understand, okay, the fact that I consider this to be my identity doesn't always mean that it will always lead to good outcomes. For example, let's say a person high neuroticism, right? He might be very vigilant about its capacity to pass an exam, which is a good thing. But you don't know how many resources you spend on false alarms. Maybe if you worked 2 days less, the same outcome would have been. You don't know this. In the same manner, a person high on conscientiousness might be the same. Better safe than sorry would be the general pattern of thinking. You don't know where you actually lose resources because you try to address false alarms about what bad things might happen, and you don't know where you actually put less resources than necessary. And this is why nature usually favorizes the idea of better safe than sorry, or going overboard with making false alarms. But as I previously put, that doesn't mean that we can't do anything. And it doesn't mean that it's not important to see where we are. Because, for example, when you go to an ophthalmologist and you see the Snellen scale, which describes how good you see in the distance, how many characters you can describe and differentiate from a specific length for where you see the table, the optometrician will say, okay, you may need sunglasses. In the same way, a psychologist might say, okay, this is where you are from a neuroticism or from a conscientious or agreeableness or extroversion point of view. You're higher than, let's say, 75% of the people. This might be good in some circumstances, it might be bad in other circumstances, but you can use your logic in order to determine when you could let it through and when you should actually look for biases in your judgment and biases inherent in your values and the way you look at things. So why are people so different? Well, some psychologists and biologists consider it that we have this structure of personality because we had different pressures from antiquity until now. There were a lot of different pressures, and this led to individual differences, namely the fact that there is no optimal personality. And there's no optimal personality because there is no optimal niche. Let's say, for example, we have a person who's high on agreeableness, the tendency to be empathetic, to feel for others. You might extend this empathy towards animals, and you might not be a good hunter. But another person who's very low in agreeableness might find it extremely simple to kill other animals, and so he has a niche. And this is what we consider to be ecological niches, in which some types of personality might be like the expression of the glove and the hand. It might be perfect for our personality traits, and some other situations might put us in conflict. For example, being forced by the circumstances to do things which we do not find easy to do. Today, however, the pressures are fundamentally different from those that acted in ancient times, because technology changes social roles, changes the pressures that act on us. So today we have illegal drugs, we have gambling, we have pornography, we have social networks and computer games, and so many tools, let's say, for instant gratification. And instant gratification is defined as this idea that is very entrenched in our ancient psychology about, let's take the resources now. I'm not going to work for something bigger later. I need the things now. For example, let's say I'm feeling bad today because I had a bad exam. Or let's say I'm feeling bad today because I had an argument with my family. Looking for instant gratification would mean something like, okay, I'm sexy, so let's put a picture with myself and with my abs from the gym, and everybody will give a like. But I'm not going to think about the consequences of what these pictures might mean 10 days later. You heard about, for example, specific Hollywood directors and actors who made some comments or posts on Instagram, on Twitter, and they later regret it. And this is, again, an example of what it means to have a average or even lower conscientiousness as a personality factor, not thinking on the long term, but thinking on the short term. I need this gratification now, which is like a drug. I need this modification in the way I experience things right now. And as society developed, very bad people, which might have narcissistic or antisocial personality disorders, invented tools in order for people to get that gratification. Imagine, for example, online casinos. From a mathematical point of view, people lose money at online casinos, but there are some specific events in which you earn a lot of money. Let's imagine pornography, for example. It gives you dopamine, or social networks. You never know how many scrolls on the mouse you have to do in order to get something that reaches your brain and elevates dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that gives you this incentive of looking for more new resources. So the environment humans inhabit now is fundamentally different from the environment our ancestors lived in. And because of this, it means that maybe in 100, 200, 300 years, the genes that codify to the specific personality factors that I talked to you about might be under selection pressures. What we have now might be a product of selective pressures that acted on our human psyche for the last 10,000, 5,000 years. But today we have other specific selective pressures, and we might want to know what personality factors might contribute or protect us from this perspective in which we look for instant gratification instead of trying to build a mountain with a grain of glass. So we know from studies that people high on neuroticism and low conscientiousness are more predisposed to substance use disorders, pathological gambling, behavioral addictions, even eating disorders. And as I put in the graphs here, you may want to look at what behavioral psychologists look at the cumulative number of responses to something, to gratification, in terms of time. And you have this graph in which fixed interval rewards, like for example, salary. Salary is a fixed interval reward. You take it every 25 or 30 days. A variable interval reward is like going to fishing. A fixed rate reward is like every 5 clicks you're going to get something. But what we know from studying animals and also humans is that the most problematic from a psychological point of view are systems which give you a variable reward. For example, you might never know when the reward happens. And this is what happens when you go to the casino and you don't know how many times you have to go to the slot machine and press that button before a jackpot comes. In the same way, Facebook or Instagram, you don't know how many scrolls you have to go in order to find something that excites your mind. So there's a very big battle between these guys who usually want to maximize their profits and exploit these problems in the mental architecture of Homo sapiens and your personality. Because people high in conscientiousness usually have this idea, as I previously told you, of inhibiting, of thinking about things. While people high in neuroticism and even extroversion usually have this idea, I have to take it now. And this is why studies have substantially shown in the literature that they are more prone to pathological gambling or internet gaming addiction or behavioral addiction or even eating disorders, because it's this idea about I need the gratification now. So this may sound bad, but even if it sounds bad, personality is not static. Personality traits do change. And we may not be interested necessarily in changes that happen naturally due to maturation, because your brain develops up until 28, 30 years. And unlike what the great psychologist William James said, that the personality is like plaster after 30 years, we know now that it isn't actually like that. Personality is more like plaster when you reach middle age, but it's not actually plaster. It's something still plastic. And lifelong plasticity actually does exist. And I put you some studies that have shown that personality traits are more prone to change in young adults, meaning people from 18 to 30 years. Why does that does happen? Okay, it happens because there's a biological process of brain maturation, but it also happens because in this period, you usually have important life events. First love, for example, first romantic relationship, more specifically, the first job, the first college, changing social roles. All these events actually shape how personality are. But if this personality is plastic in this period, what we can do is change it in the direction that's the best bet. And when I say the best bet, I'm meaning really the best bet. There's nothing in this world that will guarantee that having a high conscientiousness and low neuroticism would necessarily translate itself to the fact that you will never be a drug addict. or you have a wonderful marriage. But it's the best bet that we can do with the data that we have. It's like thinking, what should I do in circumstances when let's say I'm feeling bad. One idea would be to go to an environment like gambling or pornography or social networks in which the gratification is fast. Another idea would be to look about these things and understand how they work on my neurochemistry. And if durable changes occur in young adulthood, and we can voluntarily change them in the direction that we want, then counseling and psychotherapy would become like going to the gym. It's like, for example, you're not completely satisfied, or how big are your pectoral muscles or your biceps or your triceps, and doing specific exercises in order to increase a specific factor of personality is like going to the gym. It's not something easy. It's not something that will come with rapid improvements. Like, for example, get your dopamine and your serotonin when you look at the funny video on Facebook, and you may never know how many scrolls do I have to go with the mouse in order to reach that. But it's something that might be durable, and especially in the young adulthood period. So the best theory we have today about personality and behavioral change says that, okay, there's a natural process of brain maturation. People usually become less neurotic when they age and more conscientious. They also become less extroverted and more agreeable. But besides these general processes, there are also important life events. And the basic idea here would be, why wouldn't I actually orchestrate these life events in order for them to actually increase those personality factors that correlate positively with life outcomes and decrease those personality factors which do not? That doesn't necessarily mean that a person low in neuroticism will do well in life, but it means that it's better to be high neuroticism when real problems in your environment really are there. So evolutional efforts, as reviewed recently, are not fast, but they can be, and they can be durable when you have a good coach, when you have your goal set, and when you can actually manipulate your environment such that you understand this idea that you're not going to reduce the whole gambling issue to zero. You cannot know what extremely bad life events might do to your psyche, but you can make the best bridge, as I previously put in a metaphor. You can. So, looking at this data, maybe the idea is that everybody should try to have a good assessment of where they are in the hierarchy, to understand from a statistical point of view that deviance doesn't always mean risk, but it might generate problems, and to understand the costs and benefits of personality traits and how well do they fit to the environment in which you are. Because if you're naturally inclined to be a person which is highly neurotic, maybe therapy plus organizing your environment such that there are not many let's say uncertainties would actually help you. And in the same way about conscientiousness, maybe the idea is to set specific and realistic goals and understand how these personality factors relate to long-term life outcomes. Because you don't know what life has in for you, but you can actually do control some variables. And when you put in the balance no control and no understanding of how important personality is to life outcomes versus I should strive to modify those factors that can, maybe you should take the less risk, right? So, as a synthesis of what we have discussed, the basic idea is that we can voluntarily change our personality traits because it's not like plaster, and when we know from multiple sources and something that clearly extends more than our personal experience can reach, um, we should strive for working those personality traits that we know correlate positively with good life outcomes. Now, what good life outcomes means is dependent on what your values are, because basically, if you don't want a family or if you don't want a stable job, that's okay. That's your values. Nobody should actually attack them. But even if you do want this, and if you want to minimize the risk, science tells us what correlates with what and how we should work about with these things, because they're not necessarily, our personality is not like a bone, is more like a muscle. It's not going to be easy, but if you have enough will to do it, and if you have a good coach, you can work those traits that we know from a statistical point of view to correlate with good life outcomes.